Pack your bags, Dad. This house belongs to my husband's family now. Those words, spoken by my own daughter Diane, hit me like a physical blow. She stood in my living room, flanked by 7 strangers, her husband's entire family, announcing they were taking my home. The home I'd worked 36 years to pay off. The home where I'd raised her. But here's what Diane and her greedy entourage didn't know. I'd been expecting this moment for 2 years, and I had prepared a very special gift for them. A $2.3 million debt bomb, set to detonate the second they touched my property. My name is Vincent Crawford, and for 35 years, I was a CPA. I've seen enough financial schemes and family betrayals to know that every action has a price, and some prices are far higher than you can afford. Diane thought she was inheriting a $1.8 million house. What she actually inherited was financial annihilation, and honestly, she earned every penny of it. 2 years ago, the subtle changes began. Diane, my only child, started asking pointed questions about my finances. How much was the house worth? Did I have a will? What about life insurance? When I casually mentioned I was considering downsizing, her eyes lit up with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "Dad, you don't need to move," she'd coo, her voice dripping with false concern. "This house should stay in the family." The family? I'd think, as if Kevin Walsh, her contractor husband, who was drowning in failed business ventures, was somehow entitled to my life's work. As if his parents and siblings, who had never bothered to speak to me before Diane married him, deserved a say in my property. I'm not a vindictive man, but I'm certainly not a fool. Decades of helping clients protect their assets from greedy relatives teaches you to recognize the signs. The casual visits that always ended with probing financial questions. The way conversations subtly steered toward my advanced age and need for help managing things. The insidious suggestions that perhaps I should add Diane's name to the deed, just in case. So I started preparing. I consulted with Elizabeth Porter, an estate attorney who had handled some of my most complex client arrangements. "Vincent," she said during our first meeting, "what you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse in the making. Can we prevent it?" My reply was firm. "We can do better than that, Elizabeth. We can make it backfire spectacularly." That's when we crafted what Elizabeth brilliantly called the debt trap inheritance. It was perfectly legal, completely binding, and absolutely devastating to anyone greedy enough to spring it. You see, 2 years earlier, Kevin had started a shell company, Walsh Construction LLC. He'd listed me as a reference on his loan applications, unaware that I'd received verification calls from the lenders. The business failed within 18 months, leaving him with massive, unpayable debts. When Kevin, desperate, approached me about helping the family with his business, I agreed, with conditions he was too eager and desperate to read carefully. I guaranteed his business loan with my property as collateral. The mortgage documents were crystal clear. Anyone who took ownership of 428 Maple Drive would automatically assume all associated debt obligations. Elizabeth made sure every dolly was dotted and every T was crossed. The loan amount was precisely $2,050,000. Monthly payments were $18,200. Property taxes added another $28,000 annually. And the kicker, if ownership transferred without bank notification, the entire debt became immediately due. I had just finished signing the final documents when Diane called, checking on me for the 3rd time that week. I was about to discover if blood truly was thicker than water, or if greed would prove stronger than both. Tuesday, April 12, 2024, at exactly 3:45 p.m., my daughter knocked on my door. She didn't come alone. "Dad, we need to talk," Diane announced, stepping inside without invitation. Behind her filed Kevin, his parents Michael and Ruth Walsh, his 2 brothers and their wives. 7 adults, all wearing expressions I'd seen countless times in courtrooms when defendants thought they held winning hands. "This is quite a gathering," I said, calmly setting down my coffee. Kevin cleared his throat, puffing up like a peacock. "Vince, we've been talking as a family, and we've decided this house is too much for you to handle alone." "Is that so?" Diane jumped in, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she'd perfected. "Dad, you're 64. You shouldn't be worrying about maintenance, property taxes, All that stress. Kevin's family has experience managing properties. Ruth Walsh, a woman who had never set foot in my home before today, actually had the audacity to run her finger along my mantelpiece, checking for dust. It really is too much house for one person. We've prepared all the paperwork, Michael Walsh said, producing a folder thick with documents. Deed transfer, property management agreements, everything you need. We're taking care of you, Vince. Taking care of me, like I was some doddering old man who couldn't balance a checkbook. The thing is, Dad, Diane continued, her voice hardening, this house belongs to Kevin's family now. You'll need to pack your bags. The words hung in the air like poison gas. 36 years of raising this child, of sacrificing for her education, her wedding, her endless financial emergencies, and this was my reward. I watched them spread out through my living room, discussing which furniture they'd keep, and which rooms would go to which family members. Ruth was already measuring windows for new curtains. Kevin's brothers debated converting my study into a game room. They'd choreographed this intervention perfectly, or so they thought. You're all moving in together? I asked. It makes financial sense, Kevin explained, his chest swelling with pride. Pool our resources. Build wealth as a family unit. This property will appreciate, and we'll all benefit. And where exactly do you expect me to live? Diane had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. We found a nice senior community about 20 minutes away. Small apartment, perfect for your needs. The monthly rent is very reasonable. Reasonable? They were stealing my house and graciously offering to let me pay rent elsewhere. Michael Walsh thrust a pen toward me. Sign here, Vince. These documents transfer the deed to family ownership. Everyone's already signed except you. I looked at the papers. Sure enough, all 7 Walsh family members had signed as co-owners. They'd made themselves jointly responsible for everything that came with 428 Maple Drive. Everything. You know what? I said, taking the pen. You're absolutely right. I'm too old for all this responsibility. I signed my name with a flourish. The relief in the room was palpable. Diane actually hugged me, tears in her eyes. Oh, Dad, you're doing the right thing. You'll see. This is better for everyone. Kevin was already on his phone, calling a moving company. We'll have you relocated by this weekend, Vince. Don't worry about anything. Ruth was making plans for a housewarming party. Michael was discussing renovation ideas. They were celebrating their conquest. I spent the next few days in a small apartment I'd rented months ago, watching their frantic activity from a distance. The Walsh family, oblivious to the ticking financial time bomb, moved into my house with gusto. They emptied their savings, borrowed against their own homes, and even took out personal loans to cover the immediate costs of moving and renovating their new acquisition. They were so blinded by the perceived value of my property that they never once considered the liabilities. Then came the first payment due date. The bank, notified of the change in ownership, immediately called in the entire $2.3 million loan. The monthly payment of $18,200 plus the annual property taxes was now a single colossal demand. The Walshes, who had combined annual income of roughly $180,000, suddenly faced a debt of more than 10 times their yearly earnings. They were trapped. The phone calls started almost immediately. First Kevin, then Diane, then the entire Walsh clan, each call more frantic than the last. They accused me of manipulation, of fraud, of elder abuse. I calmly referred them to Elizabeth Porter, my attorney, who explained the legally binding terms of the deed transfer. They had signed, they had assumed the debt, and now they had to pay. One afternoon, Ruth Walsh appeared at my apartment, clearly believing she had a devastating revelation. Vincent Crawford, we know what you did. I'm sure you do, Mrs. Walsh. You were there when you did it. You planned this. You set us up. I opened my door wider and invited her in. Please, explain my terrible crime. She marched into my living room, clutching a folder. We hired a private investigator. We know you met with lawyers months before we signed those papers. Mrs. Walsh, I've been meeting with lawyers for 35 years. It's called estate planning. You knew Kevin's business was failing? Yes, since I guaranteed his loan. You knew we couldn't afford the mortgage. I knew your combined family income was approximately $180,000 annually. I also knew you were voluntarily assuming debt payments of $246,400 per year. The math wasn't complicated. She threw her folder on my coffee table. You manipulated us. You let us think the house was free and clear. Mrs. Walsh, did you or anyone in your family ask me about existing liens or mortgages before signing the deed transfer? We shouldn't have had to ask. In what universe does someone transfer property ownership without disclosing financial obligations to the new owners? She had no answer for that. Let me ask you something else, I continued. When you walked through my house on Tuesday, discussing which rooms would belong to which family members, did it occur to you that maybe, just maybe, you should understand what you were taking on? We were helping you by stealing my house. It wasn't stealing, Mrs. Walsh. You entered my home with 7 family members, announced the property now belonged to you, and told me to pack my bags. What would you call that? Family reorganization. I stared at her for a long moment. Family reorganization? Is that what you call theft in your family? Ruth Walsh's composure finally cracked. We're going to lose everything. Kevin's parents put their retirement savings into this. His brothers borrowed against their own homes. Now I understood the full scope of their disaster. They hadn't just taken my house. They'd leveraged their entire extended family's financial future on property they couldn't afford. Mrs. Walsh, why would Kevin's family invest their life savings in a property they'd never evaluated? Because Kevin said it was guaranteed money. He said you were old and confused and would just sign everything over. There it was, the truth. Finally. So, your family's financial planning was based on the assumption that I'm senile? Kevin said you were starting to slip, said you'd been forgetting things, having trouble with bills. And you believe that? Why would he lie? Because he's drowning in debt and saw my house as his life preserver. Ruth Walsh looked around my organized, well-maintained apartment. She was finally seeing what Elizabeth Porter had seen months ago. A man who was sharp, competent, and anything but confused. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Kevin lied to all of us." Mrs. Walsh, your son-in-law saw a valuable property and convinced your family they deserved it more than the man who'd spent 36 years paying for it. The fact that you believed his lies doesn't make you victims, it makes you accomplices. She started crying then, probably realizing that her retirement savings were gone, that Kevin's brothers' homes were at risk, that their entire extended family faced financial ruin because they'd chosen greed over due diligence. What can we do? Pay the debt you voluntarily assumed. We can't. Then face the consequences. Vincent, please, I'm begging you. These are good people who made a mistake. Mrs. Walsh, good people don't conspire to steal houses from elderly relatives. Good people don't invest life savings in property theft schemes. Good people ask questions before signing legal documents. She left my apartment a broken woman, finally understanding that her family's get-rich-quick scheme had turned into a financial death spiral. That evening, my phone rang. Elizabeth Porter's voice was grim. "Vincent, we have a problem." "What now?" "The Walsh family is claiming elder abuse. They filed a complaint with Adult Protective Services, alleging that you're mentally incompetent and were manipulated into the mortgage arrangements." "By whom?" "They're claiming I manipulated you, that I'm part of some scheme to defraud vulnerable seniors." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. How serious is this? Serious enough. APS has to investigate. If they find you mentally incompetent, they could void all our legal arrangements and reverse the property transfer. But I have cognitive testing. They're claiming it was fraudulent. Vincent, they're fighting for their financial lives. They'll say anything, try anything, accuse anyone. I looked around my small apartment at the life I'd been forced to rebuild from nothing. "Elizabeth, how long do these investigations take?" "Weeks, maybe months, and during that time, everything is frozen. The mortgage payments, the foreclosure proceedings, everything." But for the first time since this began, I felt a flutter of real concern. They were about to discover that cornered animals are truly dangerous, and the Walsh family was definitely cornered. The Adult Protective Services investigation began with a knock on my door Monday morning. Sarah Chen, a social worker who looked barely old enough to vote, introduced herself with the kind of professional sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Mr. Crawford, we've received reports of potential elder abuse. I'm here to assess your well-being and cognitive function." I invited her in, maintaining perfect composure, while internally, rage built like pressure in a boiler. The Walsh family was now claiming I was the victim. The investigation was thorough, intrusive, and utterly infuriating. They interviewed neighbors, doctors, and even my former colleagues. They reviewed my financial records, my medical history, and every legal document I possessed. I submitted to cognitive tests, psychological evaluations, and endless interviews. It was a humiliating ordeal, but I knew I had to remain calm and cooperative. Any sign of anger or frustration would only fuel their narrative. Elizabeth worked tirelessly, providing documentation, counter-arguments, and legal precedents. She highlighted the Walsh's own signed admissions of debt, their clear intent to seize my property, and the complete lack of due diligence on their part. "Vincent," she said one evening, "they're trying to shift the blame. They're trying to turn their own greed into your crime." "I know," I replied. "But what about the moral argument? Should I have warned them about the debt?" Elizabeth paused. "What good would that have done? They brought 7 adults to my home and announced they were taking it over. They told me to pack my bags. They'd already decided I was inconvenient and needed to be removed. What makes you think they would have listened to warnings about debt?" She didn't have an answer for that. "Elizabeth, let me ask you something. If I'd warned them about the mortgage, do you think they would have thanked me and abandoned their plan? Probably not. Or do you think they would have found another way to steal my house while avoiding the debt? They probably would have tried. So warning them would have helped them commit their crime more effectively. When you put it that way, the only way to stop a determined thief is to make theft unprofitable. I made theft of my property catastrophically expensive. The fact that they were too greedy to perform due diligence isn't my moral failing." 3 months later, the APS investigation concluded. They found no evidence of elder abuse or mental incompetence on my part. In fact, their report subtly highlighted the Walsh's predatory behavior and lack of financial responsibility. With the investigation cleared, foreclosure proceedings on 428 Maple Drive concluded. The house sold for $1.65 million, leaving a deficiency balance of $690,000 that the Walsh family would owe upon their release from prison. Yes, prison. The bank, seeing a clear case of attempted fraud and a family attempting to shirk their legal obligations, pressed charges. Kevin, Diane, and Michael Walsh were all sentenced to significant prison terms for conspiracy to commit fraud and elder abuse. The rest of the family received lighter sentences or probation, but their financial lives were in ruins. I attended the foreclosure sale and bought something small from the estate auction. A photograph of Diane as a child, smiling and innocent. That evening, I hung the photo in my apartment, not as a reminder of loss, but as evidence that people change. The child in that picture had grown into someone capable of elder abuse and conspiracy to commit fraud. I hadn't lost a daughter. I'd discovered that I'd never had the daughter I thought I'd raised. And honestly, that was a relief, because for the first time in 36 years, I was free to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than biological obligation and guilt. 2 years have passed since the Walsh family received their sentences. I'm writing this from my home office, not the apartment where I lived during the legal proceedings, but a new place I purchased in a quiet neighborhood 30 minutes from my old life. Crawford Tax Consulting has become more successful than I ever imagined. Word spread about the accountant who'd outsmarted a family of professional scammers, and suddenly seniors across Massachusetts were seeking advice on asset protection. My specialty is what I call inheritance fraud prevention, helping elderly clients structure their estates to prevent exploitation by entitled relatives. Business is, unfortunately, booming. Mr. Crawford, my newest client, Mrs. Patterson, said last week, "My son keeps asking about my will. He wants to know which house he'll inherit." Mrs. Patterson, let me ask you something. Has your son earned the right to inherit your property? What do you mean? Has he been a good son? Does he visit you regularly? Does he help with your needs? Or does he only contact you when money is involved? She was quiet for a long moment. The second one. Then why do you assume he deserves your life's work? These conversations happen daily now. Adult children who've spent years ignoring elderly parents, suddenly becoming attentive when property values rise. Families who view inheritance as an entitlement rather than a gift. I help my clients document everything, structure their estates properly, and most importantly, establish clear boundaries. Some relationships survive the honesty, others don't. But that's not my responsibility. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter from Diane. She's eligible for parole next year and wanted to rebuild our relationship. I read it once, then filed it away unopened. Not because I hate her, but because I no longer feel any obligation to pretend our relationship was healthy when it clearly wasn't. She chose to see me as an inconvenience rather than a person. That choice has consequences. My new neighbors know me as the quiet man who helps elderly folks protect themselves from predatory relatives. They don't know about my family history, and they don't need to. I've learned that blood doesn't create character, and DNA doesn't determine moral worth. Family is what you build, not what you're born into. Last month, I started dating Margaret Sullivan, a widow whose adult children live across the country, and call her every Sunday just to talk. No agenda, no requests for money, just genuine care for their mother's well-being. It's remarkable how healthy relationships feel when they're based on mutual respect rather than genetic obligation. I'm 66 now, financially secure, and finally free to choose my own family. If this story resonates with you, wherever you're listening from, remember this: you don't owe anyone access to your life just because you share their DNA. Sometimes the best inheritance you can leave is the example that actions have consequences.